How did hot dogs first become the unofficial food of Coney Island summers? Was it just the convenience of eating sausage without a plate, or something deeper about the way this particular treat matched the carnival spirit of America's playground? And why did this German immigrant food find its perfect destiny on a sandy barrier island where millions came to escape the city heat? The reality is probably messier than you'd expect, involving homesick immigrants, shrewd business people, and thousands of sweaty beachgoers who just wanted something tasty they could eat without sitting down. As we trace this savory journey from old world tradition to new world innovation, you'll discover how Coney Island became the perfect laboratory for America's most beloved handheld meal. And maybe, as we explore together, you'll find these gentle food stories helping to slow your thoughts just enough to welcome sleep. Consider subscribing if these quiet historical wanderings feel like the right way to end your day. We'd love to have you along for more peaceful journeys through the past. What's your favorite beach food memory? Drop a comment about the boardwalk treats that take you back, or simply let us know what corner of the world you're listening from tonight. Now, let your shoulders relax, maybe pull that blanket a little closer, and let's drift back to 1800s New York Harbor, where the aroma of German sausages was about to begin a very American adventure. Picture New York Harbor in the 1840s, steamships arriving almost daily, their wooden hulls heavy with hope and the weight of everything left behind. Among the passengers stepping carefully onto American soil, clutching their few belongings, you'd find thousands of German immigrants, faces weathered by ocean spray and eyes bright with possibility. These weren't just people seeking better wages or farmland. They were carriers of culinary traditions that stretched back centuries through the beer gardens of Munich and the smoky meat markets of Frankfurt. You can almost smell what they brought with them, the knowledge of sausage making as both art and sustenance. Back in the old country, a proper wurst wasn't simply meat stuffed into casing. It was a careful symphony of spices, textures, and techniques that had been whispered from father to son, master to apprentice, across generations of German butchers and cooks. Frankfurt had its delicate frankfurters, pale and refined, seasoned with white pepper and nutmeg. Vienna offered its robust wieners, darker, smokier, with hints of garlic that could make your mouth water from across a crowded marketplace. Each region guarded its own secrets, whether it was the perfect ratio of pork to beef, the precise temperature for smoking, or that special blend of marjoram and coriander that made their grandmother's recipe sing. These weren't the uniform, mass-produced sausages we know today. Each German butcher was essentially a craftsman, grinding his own meat by hand, mixing spice blends that had been perfected over decades, stuffing natural casings with the kind of pride that comes from feeding your neighbors something genuinely special. The smell alone, wood smoke mingling with garlic, the sharp bite of black pepper, the warm comfort of fennel, could transport a homesick immigrant right back to a cobblestone street in Cologne or a village market day in the Black Forest. As these immigrants settled into New York's expanding neighborhoods, particularly the crowded tenements of the Lower East Side and what would later become the German enclave of Yorkville. They faced the eternal challenge of diaspora. How do you recreate the tastes of home when everything is different? The climate, the available ingredients, even the water that went into the sausage casings, nothing was quite the same. Some immigrants gave up and adapted completely to American palates. Others became more fiercely determined than ever to preserve what they'd carried across the Atlantic. But the smartest ones, they noticed something interesting about their new neighbors. Americans were curious about foreign foods, especially when those foods were delicious, filling, and didn't cost a fortune. Street food culture was already thriving in 1840s New York. Oyster carts lined the docks, sending up clouds of steam as vendors shucked fresh shellfish for dock workers and sailors. Pie wagons rattled through the streets, their bells announcing meat pies and sweet pastries to office clerks on their lunch breaks. Hot corn sellers wandered through crowds, their portable charcoal braziers filling the air with the sweet aroma of roasted kernels slathered with butter and salt. But German sausages offered something different, something more substantial and satisfying than a quick snack. A good bratwurst or knockwurst could serve as a complete meal, packed with protein and seasoned with enough complexity to make even the most suspicious American palate take notice. By the early 1850s, German sausage vendors were becoming a familiar sight on New York's busiest corners, their small wooden carts sending up aromatic clouds that could draw customers from blocks away. These weren't just business ventures, they were acts of cultural diplomacy, introducing Americans to flavors that were simultaneously exotic and oddly comforting. Honestly, I can only imagine the conversations that must have happened around those carts. Curious Americans asking, "What's in this?" while German vendors tried to explain spice combinations that didn't have English names. The vendors learned quickly that success meant more than just authentic recipes. It meant understanding their customers. American workers wanted food they could eat on the run, without ceremony or delay. They didn't have time for the leisurely German tradition of sitting in a beer garden with friends, savoring each bite between sips of lager and conversation. They needed something portable, something that wouldn't slow them down or require sitting at a table with proper utensils. This practical challenge sparked the first wave of innovation. German vendors began serving their precious sausages with thick slices of dark rye bread, creating makeshift sandwiches that could be eaten while walking. It wasn't quite the hot dog we know today. That evolution was still years away, but it represented the crucial first step toward making old-world craftsmanship work for New World urgency. The exact timeline of these early adaptations remains frustratingly unclear to food historians. Some argue that the bread and sausage combination developed gradually over decades, while others suggest it happened more suddenly as vendors responded to specific customer demands. What we can say with certainty is that by the 1860s, German sausage culture had become thoroughly woven into New York's street food landscape. Some sources suggest this period saw tremendous experimentation among vendors, different types of bread, various methods for keeping sausages warm, creative combinations of mustard and other condiments that might appeal to American tastes. A few entrepreneurial vendors reportedly began using small portable grills that could keep sausages hot throughout the day, though the details of these early innovations are often disputed or lost to time. The immigrants longing for home had accidentally become America's gain. Their determination to preserve familiar flavors had introduced an entire city to something it never knew it needed. In the bustling, polyglot chaos of mid-19th century Manhattan, the foundation for America's great hot dog love affair was quietly being laid, one perfectly spiced sausage at a time. You have to admire their persistence. These German vendors who refused to let their culinary heritage disappear into the melting pot. They were creating something new while honoring something ancient, adapting their craft without abandoning its soul. But the real transformation, the moment when German tradition would collide with American innovation and create something entirely new, that was still waiting to happen. It would take a special place, somewhere with the right combination of crowds, carnival atmosphere, and entrepreneurial energy to turn this immigrant comfort food into a national obsession. That place was waiting, just a few miles south of Manhattan, on a windswept barrier island where the smell of salt air would soon mingle with sausage smoke, and where millions of pleasure seekers would discover their new favorite meal. The stage was set, the culinary traditions were in place, and Coney Island was about to become America's most unlikely food laboratory. As those German sausage vendors were establishing their foothold in Manhattan's bustling streets, something remarkable was happening just a few miles to the south. A windswept barrier island that had spent centuries as little more than a fishing village and rabbit hunting ground was quietly transforming itself into something America had never seen before. A democratic paradise where working-class families could taste the same pleasures once reserved for the wealthy. You would have found Coney Island in the 1860s still mostly sand dunes and scrub grass, a place where Brooklyn farmers grazed their cattle and local fishermen hauled in their nets. But visionary developers had begun to notice something that would change everything. This little island was perfectly positioned to become New York's escape valve. It offered ocean breezes for sweltering city dwellers, wide beaches for families crammed into tenement apartments, and just enough distance from Manhattan to feel like a real adventure. The transformation began with transportation, always the key to any resort's success. In 1864, the Coney Island Railroad opened its line from Brooklyn, making the journey from downtown possible in less than an hour for just 15 cents. Suddenly, this remote stretch of sand was within reach of ordinary working people. Clerks and seamstresses, dock workers, and shop girls who had never imagined they could afford a day at the seaside. You have to picture what this meant for families who had never seen the ocean except from crowded ferry decks, stepping off that train onto wooden platforms surrounded by nothing but sky and sand and the endless roll of Atlantic waves. The salt air hit you first, clean and sharp after the smoky, crowded atmosphere of the city. Then came the sound, that constant whisper and crash of surf that seemed to wash away the noise of urban life. You would have discovered a landscape that was both beautiful and slightly wild. Miles of pristine beach backed by low dunes where beach grass waved in the constant ocean breeze. Small hotels and boarding houses began to appear, simple wooden structures that offered basic accommodations for families who wanted to extend their seaside escape beyond a single day. But the real genius of Coney Island's development lay in its democratic spirit. This wasn't going to be another Newport or Saratoga Springs, where only the wealthy could afford to play. From the beginning, you could see how entrepreneurs understood that their fortune lay in serving the masses. The thousands of working-class New Yorkers who were desperate for affordable recreation and willing to travel for it. The first major hotel, the Coney Island House, had opened back in 1829, but remained a quiet retreat for wealthy sportsmen until the railroad arrived. Once transportation improved, you would have witnessed everything change. Smaller establishments sprang up along the beach, offering rooms for $1 a night and meals for 50 cents. These weren't luxury accommodations, but they were clean, comfortable, and within reach of a shop clerk's weekly wages. By the early 1870s, you could have joined thousands of visitors on sunny summer weekends, families spreading blankets on the sand, children shrieking with delight as they encountered ocean waves for the first time. Adults wandering the growing collection of small shops and refreshment stands that line the main roads leading to the beach. The social dynamics were fascinating to observe. You would have found yourself in perhaps the first place in America where different classes mixed freely in pursuit of the same simple pleasures. A factory worker's family might spread their picnic blanket just yards from where you sat watching a merchant's wife and children, all united by the democratic appeal of sun, sand, and salt water. You could watch as food vendors quickly recognize the opportunity. These thousands of day trippers needed to eat, but they didn't want to sit down to formal meals when they could be enjoying the beach. They wanted something quick, portable, and satisfying, something they could eat while walking along the sand or sitting on a piece of driftwood watching their children play in the surf. You would have seen local entrepreneurs experimenting with different offerings. Clam stands appeared along the beach, their proprietors digging fresh shellfish from the nearby waters and serving them raw or steamed with butter. Corn vendors roasted ears over driftwood fires, filling the air with sweet, smoky aromas that mixed with the salt breeze. Simple sandwich stands offered bread and cheese, cold meats, and pickles for families who wanted something more substantial. But you could sense there was clearly room for innovation. These early food offerings, while popular, didn't quite capture the festive, carnival-like atmosphere that was beginning to define the Coney Island experience. Visitors wanted something that felt special, something that matched the excitement of their day at the beach. The island's reputation grew through word of mouth and newspaper coverage. You might have read stories of families escaping the city heat, of children building sandcastles and adults rediscovering simple pleasures they'd forgotten in the rush of urban life. Brooklyn newspapers began running regular features about Coney Island attractions, encouraging more families to make the journey. You'd notice how weather patterns favored the island's development. The same ocean that provided refreshing breezes also moderated temperatures, making Coney Island noticeably cooler than sweltering Manhattan during the worst summer heat waves. This natural air conditioning became one of the resort's greatest selling points. When the city was unbearable, you could find relief at Coney Island. The question of exactly when Coney Island's modern identity began to emerge continues to spark discussion among historians. Some point to the railroad's arrival as the crucial moment, while others argue that the real transformation didn't begin until larger attractions and amusements appeared in the following decades. What seems clear is that by the mid-1870s, you could see the foundation firmly established for what would become America's premier working-class resort. You would have watched infrastructure improvements follow demand, better roads, more reliable ferry service, and the beginnings of the boardwalk system that would eventually become world famous. Each improvement brought more visitors, and more visitors created demand for better food, better entertainment, and more varied attractions. Honestly, it's remarkable how quickly this transformation happened. In less than a decade, you could have witnessed Coney Island go from an obscure fishing village to a destination that was drawing tens of thousands of visitors each summer. The combination of affordable transportation, democratic pricing, and genuine natural beauty had created something unprecedented in American leisure culture. You could sense the stage being set for culinary innovation. Thousands of hungry visitors arriving daily, all looking for food that matched the special atmosphere of their seaside escape. The island's entrepreneurs were beginning to understand that they weren't just selling meals. They were selling experiences, memories, and the kind of simple pleasure that could make a hot, exhausting week in the city feel worthwhile. And somewhere in this mix of salt air, carnival atmosphere, and entrepreneurial energy, you could feel the perfect conditions forming for a German sausage tradition to evolve into something entirely American. The stage was perfectly set by the mid-1870s. Thousands of hungry visitors streaming off trains and ferries each weekend, wandering Coney Island's sandy paths in search of affordable food that could match the magic of their seaside escape. You could sense the entrepreneurial energy crackling in the salt air, vendors experimenting with different offerings, trying to find that perfect combination of taste, convenience, and carnival atmosphere that would capture the hearts and wallets of these eager pleasure seekers. And then, according to one of America's most persistent food legends, along came Charles Feltman. You've probably heard some version of this story. The German immigrant who allegedly revolutionized American eating by serving the first hot dog in a bun at his Coney Island stand in 1867. It's a tale that's been repeated in countless books, articles, and documentaries. The kind of neat origin story that food historians both love and distrust in equal measure. The legend goes something like this. Feldman was operating a pie wagon on Coney Island when customers began complaining that his pies were too messy to eat while walking around the beach. Being a clever businessman, he supposedly switched to selling hot sausages instead, but then faced the same problem. How do you serve scalding hot sausages to customers who want to keep their hands free for enjoying their day at the beach? According to the popular narrative, Feltman's solution was pure genius. He convinced a local baker to create specially designed elongated rolls that could cradle a sausage perfectly. Customers could hold the bread instead of the burning hot meat, eat while walking, and avoid the mess that came with trying to balance plates and utensils on a windy beach. Voila, the hot dog was born. It's such a satisfying story, the kind of eureka moment that Americans love to celebrate. One immigrant's practical problem solving creates an iconic piece of food culture that spreads across an entire nation. Clean, simple, and perfectly suited to our national mythology about innovation and entrepreneurship. But here's where things get complicated. Food historians have been poking holes in the Feltman legend for decades, and what they've found is far messier than the tidy narrative suggests. The evidence for Feltman's 1867 invention is surprisingly thin. Most of it traces back to promotional materials created decades later, when his restaurant had become successful and needed an origin story for marketing purposes. Contemporary newspaper accounts from the 1860s and 1870s mention various sausage vendors at Coney Island, but they don't single out Feltman as uniquely innovative or credit him with any particular breakthrough. Some food scholars argue that the sausage and bread combination was probably evolving simultaneously among multiple vendors, each responding to the same practical challenges and customer demands. Others suggest that German immigrants had been serving sausages with bread in various forms long before anyone thought to claim credit for inventing the hot dog. You would have found the reality of 1870s Coney Island food culture far more chaotic and experimental than any single invention story suggests. Dozens of vendors trying different approaches, constantly adapting to customer feedback, borrowing ideas from each other, and gradually settling on combinations that worked. What we can say with more confidence is that by the 1870s, you could definitely find vendors at Coney Island serving hot sausages in some form of bread wrapper. Whether these were the elongated rolls of legend or simply thick slices of regular bread is harder to verify. The important thing is that the basic concept was taking hold. Portable sausages that beachgoers could eat without utensils or plates. You have to admire the marketing genius of the Feltman story. Even if its historical accuracy is questionable, it gave American food culture a concrete moment of origin, a specific person to credit, and a satisfying narrative about immigrant ingenuity solving practical problems. These are exactly the kinds of stories that nations love to tell about themselves. But the legend also obscures something more interesting, the collaborative, experimental nature of how food culture actually evolves. Instead of one brilliant inventor, you had dozens of vendors constantly trying new things, watching what worked for their competitors and gradually building towards solutions that nobody could have planned from the beginning. By the late 1870s, whatever the true origin story, you could walk along Coney Island's beaches and find multiple vendors selling hot sausages and bread of various kinds, some in rolls, some wrapped in slices, some with different toppings and condiments. The hot dog wasn't a single invention, but rather an evolving category of food that was finding its identity through trial and error. The Feltman business itself certainly existed and eventually prospered. Whether Charles Feltman deserves credit as the inventor of the hot dog is less important than recognizing that his success helped establish a template that other vendors would copy and modify. His restaurant, when it opened, became a destination in its own right, proof that there was serious money to be made in serving convenient, tasty food to Coney Island's growing crowds. What's fascinating is how quickly the concept spread once it caught on. You could see the basic hot dog idea appearing at other beach resorts along the East Coast, then moving inland to fairgrounds and city street corners. Something about the combination of portability, affordability, and satisfying taste struck exactly the right chord with American appetites. I find it interesting that we've become so attached to the idea of food having specific inventors and moments of creation. It makes for better stories, certainly, but it doesn't really reflect how culinary culture actually develops. The hot dog is probably better understood as an emergent solution to a set of problems that multiple people were working on simultaneously. But regardless of who deserves credit for what, by 1880, you could visit Coney Island and find something that was recognizably the ancestor of the modern hot dog. The basic elements were in place: the portable format, the carnival atmosphere, and most importantly, the crowds of eager customers who were falling in love with this new way of eating. The legend of Charles Feltman would continue to grow over the decades, but the real story was just beginning. Because success at Coney Island inevitably bred competition, and the competition was about to get very interesting indeed. By the 1880s, you could walk along Coney Island's expanding boardwalk and witness something unprecedented in American food culture: the birth of the carnival eating experience. This wasn't just about grabbing a quick meal anymore. It was about foods that captured the spirit of escape, celebration, and slightly reckless fun that defined the Coney Island atmosphere. You have to understand, Coney Island was becoming something entirely new in the American leisure landscape. This wasn't a genteel resort where families sat down to proper meals in hotel dining rooms. This was a place where ordinary people came to break the rules, to eat while walking, to try exotic flavors, to indulge in treats that would seem frivolous back in their everyday lives. The boardwalk itself was becoming a stage for culinary theater, vendors competing not just on taste and price, but on spectacle. You could smell the competing aromas from blocks away: roasting peanuts mingling with salt air, the sharp tang of pickles, the sweet smoke from corn roasting over charcoal fires, and threading through it all, The distinctive scent of grilling sausages that was becoming Coney Island's signature perfume. Food vendors had discovered something that restaurants back in the city were only beginning to understand, that eating could be entertainment. You didn't just buy a sausage at Coney Island. You watched it being grilled, listened to the vendor's patter, became part of the show. The sizzle and smoke weren't just cooking techniques. They were performance art designed to draw crowds and create anticipation. You could observe how this theatrical approach was transforming the simple act of serving food. Vendors developed elaborate displays, colorful signs, and showman-like personalities that turned every purchase into a small adventure. A good Coney Island food vendor wasn't just a cook. He was part carnival barker, part entertainer, part neighbor who made you feel like you were getting something special. The portable nature of boardwalk food created its own unique social dynamics. You could eat while walking, which meant you could socialize with strangers, people watch, and experience multiple attractions without ever sitting down. Food became part of the continuous flow of entertainment rather than a separate activity that interrupted the fun. This environment proved perfect for the evolution of the hot dog. Here was a food that matched the Coney Island spirit perfectly. It was handheld, so you could eat while exploring. It was affordable, so working families could indulge without guilt. It was substantial enough to be satisfying, but quick enough that you didn't miss any of the action around you. You would have noticed how the carnival atmosphere encouraged experimentation with toppings and preparations that might have seemed too bold for city street corners. Vendors began offering sauerkraut, spicy mustards, pickled onions, and other accompaniments that reflected both their ethnic heritage and their customers' adventurous mood. Some food historians argue that this period of boardwalk experimentation was crucial in establishing the hot dog's identity as distinctly American rather than simply German. The basic sausage might have been European, but the presentation, the toppings, and especially the eating experience were becoming something uniquely suited to American tastes and social habits. The success of sausage vendors attracted imitators and innovators. You could find variations that reflected the diverse backgrounds of Coney Island's vendors. Italian immigrants might add their own spice blends. Jewish vendors contributed different types of pickled accompaniments, and American-born entrepreneurs experimented with entirely new flavor combinations. But it wasn't just about the food itself. You could see how the boardwalk environment was creating new expectations about what eating out should feel like. Customers wanted their food experience to be part of their entertainment, not separate from it. They wanted to feel like they were participating in something special, something they couldn't get back home. This shift had profound implications for how food vendors operated. Success required not just good food, but also personality, showmanship, and an understanding of crowd psychology. The vendors who thrived were those who could make each customer feel like they were getting not just a meal, but a memory. You have to admire the entrepreneurial energy that this environment fostered. Vendors constantly trying new approaches, watching what worked for their competitors, adapting their offerings based on customer reactions. It was like a real-time laboratory for understanding American food preferences and social behavior. The question of exactly how these boardwalk innovations influence broader American eating habits continues to fascinate researchers. Some argue that Coney Island essentially invented the concept of casual dining as entertainment, while others suggest it simply concentrated trends that were already emerging in urban food culture. What seems undeniable is that by the mid 1880s, you could experience something at Coney Island that was genuinely new in American culture, food that was designed to be fun rather than just nourishing. Eating experiences that were crafted to create pleasure and social connection rather than simply satisfying hunger. The hot dog was perfectly positioned to become the symbol of this new approach to food. It embodied everything that made Coney Island eating special. It was portable, social, affordable, and just exotic enough to feel like a treat while being familiar enough that anyone could enjoy it. But perhaps most importantly, you could sense how the hot dog was becoming associated with freedom. Freedom from formal dining rules, freedom from ethnic food boundaries, freedom from the idea that eating had to be a serious, seated activity. At Coney Island, you could grab a hot dog and wander wherever your curiosity led you. This sense of food as liberation would prove to be one of the hot dog's most enduring appeals, and it was being perfected right there on the Coney Island boardwalk, where the salt air carried the mingled aromas of a dozen different cultures, all competing to create the perfect bite of American summer. The stage was set for the next phase of evolution, because all this success and innovation was about to attract some very ambitious competitors who would push the Coney Island food scene to even greater heights. The success of Coney Island's hot dog vendors in the 1880s and 1890s inevitably attracted ambitious competitors. And nowhere was this entrepreneurial energy more evident than in the countless origin stories that began sprouting around different vendors, each claiming to be the real inventor or innovator who deserved credit for perfecting America's favorite handheld meal. You could walk the boardwalk during this golden age and hear a dozen different tales, each vendor ready with his own version of how he'd revolutionized the hot dog business, improved upon his competitors' methods, or discovered the secret combination of ingredients that made his sausages superior to all others. These weren't just business rivalries. They were competing mythologies, each designed to attract customers and establish lasting reputations. One name that would eventually rise above all others was Nathan Handwerker, a Polish immigrant whose story has become almost as legendary as Charles Feltman's, though equally complicated when you try to separate documented facts from promotional folklore. According to the most popular version of the Nathan's famous origin story, Handwerker arrived at Coney Island in the early 1910s as a young man working for wages at Charles Feltman's established restaurant. The legend tells us he was earning just $11 a week as a roll slicer, watching Feltman charge 10 cents for each hot dog while dreaming of starting his own business. The story goes that Handwerker received crucial advice from two regular customers at Feltman's, a couple of entertainers named Eddie Cantor and Jimmy Durante, who supposedly urged him to open his own stand and undercut Feltman's prices. Armed with their encouragement and a recipe allegedly provided by his wife Ida, Handworker scraped together $300 and opened his own hot dog stand in 1916. His revolutionary strategy, according to the legend, was breathtakingly simple. Sell hot dogs for 5 cents instead of Feltman's 10 cents. Use higher quality beef instead of the cheaper pork and beef mixtures that other vendors favored. And rely on volume sales to make up for the lower profit margins. You can almost picture the drama that this narrative suggests. The underdog employee taking on his established boss. The immigrant entrepreneur betting everything on a pricing strategy that seemed to defy common sense. The quality versus quantity gamble that would either make his fortune or destroy his savings. It's exactly the kind of American success story that we love to celebrate. The plucky immigrant who outwits the established competition through a combination of hard work, smart strategy, and superior product quality. David versus Goliath, played out with hot dogs and mustard instead of slings and stones. But food historians have found the Nathan Handworker story almost as problematic as the Feltman legend. Much of the specific detail comes from company promotional materials created decades after the supposed events. When Nathan's Famous had become successful and needed compelling origin stories for marketing purposes. The timeline gets particularly murky when you try to verify key details. Some sources suggest Handworker opened his stand as early as 1912. Others place it as late as 1920. The Eddie Cantor and Jimmy Durante story, while charming, appears in sources that can't be independently verified. Even the famous 5-cent price point may be more legend than documented fact. What we can say with more confidence is that by the late 1910s, you would have found intense competition among Coney Island hot dog vendors, multiple stands and restaurants fighting for customers through a combination of pricing strategies, quality improvements, and aggressive marketing. The specific details of how Nathan Handworker fit into this competitive landscape are harder to pin down than the legend suggests. Some culinary researchers argue that the focus on individual success stories obscures a more interesting truth, that the hot dog's evolution during this period was driven by collective innovation rather than single breakthrough moments. Vendors were constantly borrowing ideas from each other, experimenting with different approaches, and responding to customer feedback in ways that gradually improved the entire category. You have to wonder how many other vendors from this era had equally compelling stories that simply didn't get preserved in the historical record. Entrepreneurs who made significant contributions to hot dog culture but lacked the marketing savvy or business longevity to ensure their tales survived. The emphasis on competitive pricing that characterizes most of these vendor stories does reflect a documented reality of Coney Island food culture. This was a place where working-class customers had limited budgets and vendors needed to offer genuine value to succeed. Whether Nathan Handworker specifically pioneered the 5-cent hot dog or simply participated in a broader trend toward affordable pricing is less important than recognizing how this economic pressure drove innovation throughout the industry. You could observe how the competitive environment encouraged vendors to differentiate themselves through quality improvements, unique toppings, superior service, or memorable personalities. Success required more than just low prices. Customers had choices, and they rewarded vendors who could offer something special beyond basic sustenance. I find it fascinating how these business origin stories have become so central to American food culture. We seem to need specific heroes and villains, dramatic turning points, and decisive victories. The Messier reality of gradual innovation and collective experimentation doesn't make for marketing copy, but it probably comes closer to how culinary culture actually develops. What's undeniable is that by 1920, you could visit Coney Island and find a hot dog scene that was far more sophisticated and competitive than anything that had existed just a decade earlier. Multiple vendors offering different styles, price points, and quality levels, all competing for the attention of millions of annual visitors. The hot dog had evolved from a simple solution to the problem of portable beach food into something more complex, a product category with its own internal competition, brand loyalties, and cultural significance. Whether Nathan Handwerker deserves primary credit for this transformation is less important than recognizing that his success, real or legendary, represented the emergence of hot dogs as serious business rather than just convenient snacks. The stage was set for even more dramatic developments because Coney Island's success was about to attract the attention of much larger entertainment enterprises that would transform not just the hot dog business, but the entire concept of American amusement. Just as the hot dog vendors were establishing their competitive rhythms along Coney Island's boardwalk, something extraordinary was beginning to take shape that would transform not just the food business, but the entire concept of American entertainment. You were about to witness the birth of the modern amusement park, and with it, a quantum leap in the number of hungry customers who would need feeding. The late 1890s brought visionary entrepreneurs to Coney Island who understood that the public's appetite for spectacle was growing faster than simple beach pleasures could satisfy. These weren't just businessmen. They were showmen who grasped that Americans were ready for entertainment experiences that were bigger, wilder, and more thrilling than anything they'd encountered before. You could sense the anticipation building as construction began on what would become legendary entertainment complexes. Massive projects that dwarfed the simple hotels and refreshment stands that had previously defined Coney Island's landscape. The scale alone was breathtaking. These new ventures required investments that represented fortunes, not just the modest savings of individual vendors. Steeplechase Park opened in 1897, the brainchild of George Tilliou, who had traveled to the Chicago World's Fair and returned home convinced that Americans were hungry for mechanical thrills and organized fun. You would have marveled at his signature attraction, a steeplechase ride where customers mounted mechanical horses that raced around an oval track while crowds of spectators cheered and laughed at the riders' undignified struggles to maintain their seats. But Tilia's genius extended beyond individual attractions. He understood that the real magic happened when you created an entire environment dedicated to pleasure and mild transgression. Steeplechase Park wasn't just a collection of rides. It was a carefully orchestrated experience where social conventions were temporarily suspended and adults were encouraged to act like children. Then came Luna Park in 1903, a fantasy landscape that pushed the boundaries of what entertainment could be even further. You could wander through elaborate architectural facades that mimicked everything from oriental palaces to Swiss chalets, all illuminated by thousands of electric lights that turned night into a glowing wonderland. The scale was unprecedented. Luna Park covered acres and could accommodate tens of thousands of visitors simultaneously. The impact on food vendors was immediate and dramatic. Where Coney Island had previously attracted thousands of visitors on busy days, these new amusement parks were drawing tens of thousands, sometimes approaching 100,000 people on peak summer weekends. The math was simple but staggering. More people meant exponentially more opportunities to sell food. You have to picture what this meant for hot dog vendors. Instead of serving beachgoers who might purchase one meal during their visit, they were now facing customers who spent entire days at the parks, working up appetites as they screamed through roller coasters, navigated fun houses, and participated in games of chance that seemed designed to build both excitement and hunger. The amusement park environment created perfect conditions for hot dog sales. Customers were constantly moving between attractions. They had their hands full with tickets and prizes, and they were in a festive mood that made them more willing to try new foods or indulge in treats they might resist in their everyday lives. But the parks also raised the stakes for food vendors. Success now required serving not just dozens of customers per day, but hundreds or even thousands. This wasn't a business for small-scale operators anymore. It demanded vendors who could handle massive volume while maintaining quality and speed. You could observe how the most successful vendors adapted to these new demands. They developed more efficient cooking methods, streamlined their ordering processes, and created systems that could handle crowds that might surge unpredictably based on the weather, the day of the week, or the popularity of nearby attractions. The theatrical atmosphere of the amusement parks also influenced how food was presented and sold. Vendors who had previously focused mainly on taste and price now needed to compete on spectacle as well. The simple act of grilling a hot dog became part of the entertainment, with vendors developing showman-like personalities and cooking techniques that drew crowds as much for the performance as for the food. Some food historians suggest that this period marked the transformation of the hot dog from ethnic immigrant food to genuinely American popular culture. The amusement park environment stripped away the specifically German associations and made hot dogs part of a broader carnival experience that felt entirely native to American sensibilities. The question of how much the amusement park boom contributed to standardizing hot dog preparation and presentation continues to intrigue researchers. Some argue that the need to serve massive crowds efficiently led to more uniform products, while others suggest that competition for customer attention actually encouraged greater variety and innovation. What seems clear is that by 1905, you could visit Coney Island and find a hot dog scene that was operating on an entirely different scale than just a decade earlier. Vendors who had once been satisfied serving a few dozen customers per day were now handling hundreds, and the most successful operations were beginning to resemble small factories more than simple food stands. The success bred its own challenges. With so much money to be made, competition became fiercer and more sophisticated. Vendors needed to differentiate themselves not just through price and quality, but through location, marketing, and their ability to handle the logistics of mass food service. You could sense that something fundamental had changed in American food culture. The hot dog was no longer just a convenient beach snack, but had become an integral part of the American entertainment experience. The combination of carnival atmosphere, massive crowds, and competitive pressure had forged it into something that could satisfy both physical hunger and the psychological appetite for fun. I think it's remarkable how quickly this transformation happened. In less than a decade, the humble sausage inbread that had evolved from German immigrant traditions became the signature food of America's most spectacular entertainment destination. The amusement parks hadn't just provided a larger market for hot dogs. They had fundamentally changed what hot dogs meant in American culture. The stage was set for the next crucial development, because all this success was about to attract the attention of transportation planners who would make Coney Island accessible to millions more potential customers than anyone had previously imagined possible. The spectacular success of Coney Island's amusement parks in the early 1900s had created an almost impossible problem. How do you transport hundreds of thousands of people to a barrier island that was originally designed to accommodate a few hundred beachgoers? The existing railroad and ferry services were already straining under the weight of weekend crowds, and everyone could see that something dramatic needed to happen to unlock Coney Island's full potential. You could witness the transportation revolution beginning to take shape in the form of elevated railway lines that snaked through Brooklyn like iron arteries, carrying working-class New Yorkers toward their weekend paradise with unprecedented speed and efficiency. But the real game changer was still coming. The subway system that would transform Coney Island from a regional attraction into a destination accessible to millions. The subway's arrival at Coney Island represents one of those pivotal moments where infrastructure development and cultural change intersect in ways that nobody could have fully predicted. You were about to see how improved transportation could fundamentally alter not just who visited Coney Island, but how they experienced it and what they expected from their day at the beach. The BMT line reached Coney Island in 1915, followed by additional subway connections that made the journey from Manhattan possible in less than an hour for just a nickel. The same price that, according to legend. Nathan Handwerker was charging for his hot dogs. Suddenly, a day at Coney Island cost less than many people spent on lunch, and the economic barriers that had previously limited access began to crumble. You have to imagine what this meant for families who had never been able to afford regular leisure trips. Parents who worked 6 days a week in factories or shops could now take their children to see the ocean, ride the rides, and experience pleasures that had previously seemed impossibly exotic. The subway didn't just provide transportation, it democratized fun in ways that few other innovations in American history had managed to achieve. The numbers were staggering. Where Coney Island had previously attracted hundreds of thousands of visitors per season, the subway era brought millions. On peak summer days, you could find upwards of 1 million people crowding onto the island's beaches, boardwalks, and amusement parks, a human density that created both incredible opportunities and logistical nightmares. For hot dog vendors, the subway boom was like discovering a gold mine in their backyard. The customer base had expanded exponentially, but so had the competition and the operational challenges. You could no longer succeed by simply setting up a cart and grilling sausages. The scale of demand required industrial-level thinking about food production, distribution, and service. The most successful vendors began developing systems that resembled assembly lines more than traditional cooking. Pre-cooked sausages kept warm in steam tables, buns toasted in batches, condiments organized for maximum efficiency. The romantic image of the individual vendor lovingly grilling each hot dog over charcoal was giving way to something more mechanized and systematic. But the subway also brought new types of customers with different expectations and budgets, alongside the working-class families who had always been Coney Island's core audience. You could now find middle-class visitors who arrived with higher standards for food quality and service. Vendors needed to figure out how to serve both markets without alienating either. You could observe how the transportation revolution encouraged vendors to think beyond individual sales toward building recognizable brands and repeat customers. When people could visit Coney Island regularly rather than treating it as a once-a-year special occasion, establishing customer loyalty became much more important than simply maximizing profit on each transaction. The subway schedule also created new rhythms for the food business. Massive influxes of customers arriving on morning trains, steady crowds throughout the day, and evening rushes as people headed home. Vendors who understood these patterns and planned accordingly had significant advantages over those who simply reacted to crowds as they appeared. Some transportation historians argue that the subway's impact on Coney Island food culture extended far beyond simply bringing more customers. The rapid, affordable access fundamentally changed how New Yorkers thought about leisure and consumption, making impulsive food purchases feel less significant and encouraging experimentation with different vendors and menu items. The question of whether improved transportation led to standardization or diversification in Coney Island's food offerings continues to generate scholarly debate. Some researchers suggest that serving larger crowds required more uniform products, while others argue that competition for the expanded customer base actually encouraged greater innovation and specialization. What seems undeniable is that by 1920, you could step off a subway train at Coney Island and find yourself in a food landscape that was both more crowded and more sophisticated than anything that had existed before mass transit. Vendors who had learned to handle thousands of customers per day, food operations that resembled small restaurants more than simple stands, and a level of competition that rewarded efficiency, quality, and customer service in equal measure. The subway had solved the transportation problem so thoroughly that new challenges emerged. How do you feed 1 million people in a single day without creating chaos? How do you maintain food safety and quality when operating at such massive scale? How do you preserve the carnival atmosphere that made Coney Island special while dealing with industrial-level logistics? You could sense that the hot dog business was evolving into something that transcended simple food service. Vendors were becoming experts in crowd psychology, mass production, and brand building. The skills required for success were becoming more complex and specialized, separating the serious operators from those who couldn't adapt to the new realities. I'm struck by how quickly this transformation happened. In less than a decade, the combination of amusement parks and mass transit had turned Coney Island into something that resembled a preview of modern American consumer culture. The hot dog vendors weren't just feeding people anymore. They were participating in the creation of an entirely new kind of leisure experience. But this success was about to face its greatest test, because the innovations and efficiencies developed at Coney Island were beginning to attract attention from entrepreneurs who wondered whether this model could work in other locations, serving different kinds of customers under very different circumstances. By the 1920s, the innovations and efficiencies that Coney Island's hot dog vendors had developed under pressure from massive crowds and fierce competition were beginning to catch the attention of entrepreneurs across America. But the real breakthrough came when someone realized that the Coney Island model might work even better in a completely different environment. One where customers came not for beach fun, but for an entirely different kind of American obsession. You could sense the shift beginning as enterprising vendors started appearing at baseball stadiums throughout the Northeast. These weren't random food experimenters, but seasoned operators who understood that sports crowds shared crucial characteristics with amusement park visitors. They arrived hungry, they wanted food they could eat while watching the action, and they were in celebratory moods that made them willing to pay premium prices for convenience and atmosphere. The baseball connection would prove to be one of the most important developments in hot dog history, not because stadiums provided larger crowds than Coney Island, but because they offered something even more valuable: consistent, predictable demand that lasted from April through October, crowds that returned regularly rather than just on special occasions, and a setting that was becoming central to American cultural identity. You have to picture the early baseball vendors. many of them literally walking away from successful Coney Island operations during the off-season to test whether their skills would translate to a different kind of entertainment venue. They brought with them hard-won expertise in crowd management, efficient food preparation, and the theatrical presentation that had proved so crucial to Coney Island's success. The stadium environment created its own unique challenges and opportunities. Vendors needed to navigate narrow aisles while carrying heavy loads of food and supplies. They had to serve customers who were seated rather than standing. And they were competing for attention with the game itself rather than simply with other food vendors. But the baseball setting also offered advantages that Coney Island couldn't match. A captive audience that couldn't easily leave to find food elsewhere. Regular customers who developed loyalty to specific vendors. And an atmosphere where buying food was considered part of the entertainment rather than a distraction from it. You could observe how successful baseball vendors adapted Coney Island techniques to their new environment. They developed portable warming equipment that could keep hot dogs at proper temperatures while walking through stadium sections. They perfected rhythmic calling techniques that could cut through crowd noise without disrupting the game. And they learned to time their sales pitches to the natural breaks in baseball action. The famous cry of hot dogs, "Get your hot dogs here," became as much a part of the baseball experience as the seventh inning stretch. Vendors who could project their voices clearly and develop memorable personal styles found themselves with regular customers who would wait for their specific vendor rather than buying from whoever happened to be nearest. Some sports historians suggest that the integration of hot dog vendors into baseball culture helped establish food as an integral part of the American sports experience rather than just a practical necessity. The vendor's theatrical presentation and the crowd's enthusiastic response created a form of entertainment that existed alongside the game itself. The success at baseball stadiums encouraged expansion to other venues. County fairs, circus performances, political rallies, and any large gathering where people might appreciate convenient, affordable food. You could begin to see hot dog vendors appearing wherever Americans gathered for entertainment, celebration, or community events. But the real breakthrough came when vendors realized that they didn't need to wait for existing events. They could create their own permanent locations in high-traffic urban areas. The transition from mobile vending to fixed hot dog stands represented a fundamental shift in how the business operated and how customers experienced this increasingly popular food. You could witness the emergence of the classic American hot dog cart, a mobile kitchen that could be positioned at busy street corners, outside office buildings, near subway stations, or anywhere that promised steady foot traffic. These weren't just Coney Island beach operations relocated. They were sophisticated small businesses that required understanding of urban geography, customer flow patterns, and the complex regulations that govern street food in major cities. The question of how quickly hot dog culture spread from Coney Island to the rest of America continues to intrigue food historians. Some argue that the expansion was rapid and systematic, driven by vendors who consciously exported successful techniques, while others suggest that similar food innovations were developing independently in different regions, and the Coney Island influence has been overstated. What seems clear is that by the mid 1920s, you could find hot dog vendors in most major American cities, not just copying the basic Coney Island model, but adapting it to local tastes, regulations, and customer preferences. Regional variations began to emerge that reflected local ingredients, ethnic influences, and cultural traditions. The standardization versus regionalization debate reveals something fascinating about American food culture. While the basic concept of sausage in bread was spreading nationwide, individual vendors and regions were developing their own distinctive approaches to preparation, toppings, and presentation. The hot dog was becoming simultaneously more universal and more locally specific. You could sense that something fundamental had changed in American eating habits. The hot dog had evolved from a novelty beach food into a ubiquitous urban convenience that people encountered in their daily lives rather than just during special occasions. This transition from leisure food to everyday sustenance marked a crucial step in the hot dog's journey toward becoming a defining element of American food culture. I find it remarkable how the lessons learned under the unique pressures of Coney Island's carnival atmosphere proved so transferable to completely different environments. The crowd psychology skills, the efficiency innovations, and the theatrical presentation techniques that had been developed to serve beachgoers turned out to work equally well for baseball fans, commuters, and anyone else who wanted good food without sacrificing convenience or time. But the hot dog's conquest of America was about to face its most ambitious challenge yet, because entrepreneurs were beginning to wonder whether this humble immigrant food could transcend its working-class origins and become something that defined American culture not just for the people who ate it, but for the entire world that was watching America's rise to global prominence. By the late 1920s and early 1930s, something extraordinary was happening to the humble hot dog that had begun its American journey on Coney Island's sandy boardwalks. It was transcending its origins as convenient beach food and becoming woven into the fabric of American identity in ways that no one could have predicted when Charles Feltman first allegedly served sausages in bread to sunburned beachgoers. You could witness this transformation most clearly in how hot dogs were beginning to appear at quintessentially American celebrations and gatherings. 4th of July picnics, county fairs, political rallies, and backyard barbecues where families gathered to celebrate everything from holidays to homecomings. The hot dog wasn't just food anymore. It was becoming a symbol of American informality, democracy, and the kind of unpretentious enjoyment that the nation was beginning to see as distinctly its own. The timing of this cultural integration wasn't accidental. America in the 1920s and 1930s was defining itself as a modern, democratic society that valued accessibility and efficiency over European formality and tradition. The hot dog embodied these values perfectly. It was affordable, convenient, egalitarian, and distinctly new world in its approach to combining old world traditions with practical American innovation. You have to understand how radical this transformation was in less than 60 years. A food that had emerged from German immigrant communities had become so thoroughly American that it was beginning to represent the nation's character to both its own citizens and the watching world. This wasn't just culinary adoption. It was cultural alchemy on a scale that few foods in history have achieved. The hot dogs association with baseball had been particularly crucial in this process. Baseball was becoming America's national pastime just as the hot dog was establishing itself as America's most democratic food. The two phenomena reinforced each other, creating a cultural connection that made hot dogs seem as fundamentally American as apple pie or the Star-Spangled Banner. You could observe how this symbolic transformation was reflected in the language that surrounded hot dogs. Vendors and customers alike began using terminology that emphasized American identity rather than German heritage. Frankfurter and Wiener gave way to hot dog and American sausage, reflecting a conscious effort to claim this food as native rather than imported. The Depression years of the 1930s only strengthened the hot dog's position in American culture. Here was a food that provided genuine nourishment at prices that even struggling families could afford. Hot dog vendors became symbols of entrepreneurial resilience, small businessmen who could start with minimal capital and build sustainable enterprises through hard work and customer service. But the hot dog's most dramatic moment on the national stage came in 1939, when Eleanor Roosevelt served hot dogs to King George VI and Queen Elizabeth during their visit to the Roosevelt family estate in Hyde Park, New York, an event that scandalized traditionalists but perfectly captured the democratic spirit that Americans were beginning to see as their greatest contribution to world civilization. You can imagine the cultural significance of that moment, the most powerful monarchy in the world being served America's most informal food by the nation's First Lady. It was a gesture that announced America's confidence in its own values and its willingness to present them to the world without apology or pretense. Some cultural historians argue that this period marked the hot dog's transition from ethnic food to national symbol, a transformation that reflected broader changes in how America understood its identity as a nation of immigrants who had created something genuinely new rather than simply transplanting European traditions. The question of how consciously this symbolic transformation was orchestrated versus how naturally it emerged from American eating habits continues to interest scholars. Some suggest that food industry marketing played a significant role in promoting hot dogs as patriotic fare, while others argue that the association developed organically from the food's genuine popularity and accessibility. What seems clear is that by 1940, you could find hot dogs being served at events that had nothing to do with beaches, baseball, or carnival atmospheres, political conventions, church picnics, school cafeterias, and family gatherings where the choice of food was meant to communicate values of inclusivity, informality, and democratic accessibility. The regional variations that had emerged as hot dogs spread across the country also reflected this process of cultural integration. Chicago developed its distinctive style with specific toppings and preparation methods. New York maintained its connection to the original Coney Island tradition. And dozens of other cities and regions created their own approaches that reflected local tastes and cultural influences. You could sense that the hot dog had achieved something remarkable in American food culture. It had become simultaneously universal and local, familiar enough to serve at the most formal state occasions, yet flexible enough to accommodate regional preferences and individual creativity. This adaptability would prove to be one of the hot dog's greatest strengths as American culture itself became more mobile and diverse. Unlike foods that required specific ingredients or elaborate preparation, hot dogs could be successfully adapted to virtually any setting or cultural context while maintaining their essential character. I think what's most fascinating about this period is how the hot dog managed to become a symbol of American democracy without losing its practical appeal as convenient, affordable food. It didn't need to choose between symbolism and substance because its symbolic power actually derived from its practical accessibility. But perhaps the hot dog's most important achievement during these decades was proving that American food culture could create genuine innovations rather than simply adapting European traditions. The combination of immigrant knowledge, American entrepreneurship, and democratic values had produced something that was both authentically new and genuinely satisfying. This success would soon face its ultimate test because America was about to enter a global conflict that would put the nation's values, including its food culture, under unprecedented scrutiny from both allies and enemies who questioned whether American informality represented strength or weakness in the face of authoritarian challenge. As we reach the end of our journey through the delicious history of how hot dogs conquered Coney Island and then America itself, you can reflect on something quite remarkable. What began as German immigrants trying to recreate familiar flavors in a new land had evolved into one of the most distinctly American cultural phenomena of the 20th century. And it all started with vendors trying to solve the simple problem of how to feed hungry beachgoers without making them sit down. The legacy that emerged from those early experiments on Coney Island's windswept boardwalk extends far beyond food culture. You're looking at the birth of modern American casual dining, the development of efficient mass food service, and the creation of a business model that would eventually influence everything from fast food chains to stadium concessions to street cart operations in cities around the world. You can trace direct lines from Charles Feltman's alleged innovation and Nathan Handwerker's legendary competition to the modern hot dog industry that generates billions of dollars annually and employs thousands of people across the country. But more importantly, you can see how their entrepreneurial energy helped establish principles that became fundamental to American business culture. The emphasis on speed, convenience, and customer accessibility that Coney Island vendors pioneered out of necessity became defining characteristics of American food service. The idea that good food should be affordable, quickly available, and enjoyable without ceremony or pretense. These weren't just business strategies. They were expressions of democratic values that distinguished American culture from more hierarchical European traditions. You have to appreciate how the challenges of serving massive crowds at Coney Island forced innovations that would prove useful far beyond beach food. The development of efficient cooking techniques, standardized preparation methods, and systematic customer service approaches that could handle thousands of transactions per day while maintaining quality and profitability. The hot dog's journey from immigrant comfort food to national symbol also demonstrates something profound about American cultural identity. The nation's ability to take elements from multiple traditions and synthesize them into something genuinely new. The German sausage-making expertise, the practical American innovation, the carnival atmosphere of Coney Island, and the democratic spirit of baseball culture all contributed to creating something that was more than the sum of its parts. Today, when you bite into a hot dog at a baseball game, a backyard barbecue, or a street corner in any American city, you're participating in a cultural tradition that stretches back to those pioneering vendors who figured out how to make great food accessible to ordinary people. The connection might not be obvious, but it's real and meaningful. Some food historians suggest that the hot dog's success helped establish the template for how ethnic foods could become mainstream in American culture, not by abandoning their origins, but by adapting to American values of convenience, affordability, and democratic accessibility. This pattern would later be repeated with pizza, tacos, hamburgers, and countless other foods that immigrants brought to America. The question of whether Coney Island truly deserves credit as the birthplace of the American hot dog continues to generate friendly debates among food enthusiasts and historians. But perhaps that's the wrong question to ask. What seems more important is recognizing how the unique combination of circumstances at Coney Island created perfect conditions for culinary innovation and cultural transformation. You could argue that Coney Island's greatest contribution wasn't inventing the hot dog, but rather proving that American food culture could be both commercially successful and genuinely enjoyable, that the pursuit of profit and the creation of pleasure weren't contradictory goals, but could actually reinforce each other when approached with creativity and respect for customers. The vendors who gathered on those beaches and boardwalks more than a century ago were solving immediate practical problems: how to feed people quickly, how to make a living in a competitive environment, how to create something that customers would remember fondly and return to experience again. They probably didn't realize they were also helping to define what would become distinctly American approaches to business, leisure, and community. But perhaps the most enduring legacy of Coney Island's hot dog culture is something less tangible, but equally important: the demonstration that food could be a source of democratic pleasure rather than social division. At Coney Island, everyone ate the same hot dogs, regardless of their background, income, or social status. The beach was a place where food brought people together rather than setting them apart. I'm struck by how this democratic food culture that emerged from the practical challenges of feeding Coney Island's crowds became such a powerful symbol of American values. The idea that good things should be accessible to everyone. That innovation could emerge from ordinary people solving everyday problems, and that pleasure and profit could coexist without corrupting each other. The story of hot dogs at Coney Island ultimately tells us something hopeful about American culture at its best. The capacity for different traditions to come together and create something new. The ability of ordinary entrepreneurs to build something meaningful from modest beginnings, and the power of simple pleasures to bring people together across the boundaries that might otherwise divide them. As you consider this remarkable journey from German immigrant food to American cultural icon, you might find yourself marveling at how much history can be contained in something as simple as a sausage in a bun, and how the most ordinary experiences can connect us to larger stories about who we are and how we came to be that way. The salt air of Coney Island still carries echoes of all those voices, vendors calling out their offerings, crowds laughing and chatting as they wandered between attractions, the sizzle of sausages on countless grills, all blending together into the soundtrack of American summer. And maybe, as you settle deeper into your pillow tonight, you can almost smell that mixture of ocean breeze and grilling food. Almost hear the distant sound of carousel music and the gentle crash of waves. Feeling the peaceful satisfaction that comes from understanding how simple human needs for food and fun combined to create something lasting and meaningful. The vendors have long since closed their stands for the night. The crowds have headed home on the last trains, but the legacy they created together continues. In every hot dog shared at a picnic, every vendor working to make customers smile, every moment when good food brings people together in this simple democracy of shared enjoyment. Let your breathing slow with the rhythm of those distant waves. Let your thoughts drift like the salt air across the peaceful water, and rest easy knowing that sometimes the most beautiful parts of our culture emerge from the most ordinary human desires. To eat something delicious, to enjoy a moment of pleasure, and to feel connected to the community of people who share our simple hungers and joys. Close your eyes and drift away into the gentle night, where the echoes of 100 summers blend into the quiet music of sleep and dreams and the endless rhythm of waves against a distant shore.